Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you. Thank you for joining me on this lecture where we are going to be talking about the 1980s, building from the discussions that we've had about the 1970s, in particular the challenges to leadership, the loss in faith by the public in terms of political leadership, the direction of the country, the direction of the world. Um, and we're really going to be looking at the 1980s, which represents a shift in terms of how people saw themselves moving out of the 1970s into the 1980s. And we're also going to look at some other contributing factors, which actually fundamentally change and give rise to some interesting directions in which the country and the world would take. Essentially looking at culture, social issues, politics, world events, and then of course also looking at economics as well. And so, the 1980s really represents and is dominated by major one political figure and two, um, you know, national, bodies. So we're looking at Ronald Reagan, who was the president from 1981 to 1980, 89, 88, 89. And what we're going to look at is the role of Reagan. We're going to look at the Cold War in particular, and we're really going to be looking at the changes in technology, how people got their information, the rise of the computer, personal computer, other recording devices like the camcorder. And what's going to be interesting is that this is, for those of you who are in this course, if you were born in the 1980s, maybe you grew up in the 1980s. I'm actually a child of the 1980s, so I find it quite interesting and, I guess somewhat grateful that I'm still around, that I can actually talk about it. But the fact that it is being talked about in a history class, is it's interesting because, for somebody who actually went through a lot of the events that we're going to talk about, I can give you that perspective of somebody, who was actually there, a way to think about it. But, it's very interesting to actually have been through it, but then to actually review, learn, and critique it as well. So let's go ahead and let's get started. So we're going to be taking a look at a couple of areas. Of course, we're going to be looking at Ronald Reagan. This is him right there, in case if you've never seen him before. But that is Ronald Reagan. We're going to look at Cold War and foreign policy, a lot of global issues that were going on at this time. The two superpowers in terms of the USSR, Soviet Union, as well as the United States. We're going to look at the economic shifts that were going on around the globe as well as in the United States. Definitely look at how technology, culture, and lifestyle both affected and were affected by it. And then, of course, we're going to look at some of the social issues as well, that dominated this period in the 1980s. Okay, so if we break down Reagan's presidency, and of course, I cannot go through every single aspect of it, but what I want you all to think about is how important Reagan is to the United States, its history, its culture, its direction that it took, as well as the role that Reagan played globally in terms of the fight against communism, the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union that would happen in the 1990s, and all of those aspects. So if you remember, coming out of the 1970s, you had Richard Nixon, the Watergate scandal, his eventual, impeachment. He resigns from Congress. You have Gerald Ford, who immediately, pardons President Nixon, which then, from the country's perspective, is that, well, bad guys win, people in power are totally corrupt, there is no justice, et cetera, et cetera. And, that really left an extremely bad taste in many people's mouths. There was a huge distrust, right? The 1970s were really a period where we come out of the 60s in terms of this idea of that, yes, we can, a communal ideal, if we really work hard to change the fundamental, aspects of our country in terms of who can vote, who can participate, what does it mean to be a multiracial democracy? Maybe it could be possible. But there is that disenchantment that goes into the 70s, right? Many people were exhausted from the Vietnam War. They were exhausted from, the efforts that really had started under, Dr. Martin Luther King in terms of, they hadn't seen any real change, right? And then there was that radicalization in terms of a new approach that's really embodied in Malcolm X, the Black Panthers, right? A Black consciousness movement. And this, eventually shifts into the later 1970s when they elect Jimmy Carter. There's a huge crisis in terms of inflation, the oil crisis, right? OPEC, all of these issues. And so what was happening in the late 1970s, especially under Carter, when you look at that crisis of confidence speech, while Carter, yes, is actually talking about something deeper when he says that there's something deeper in our country more important than gas lines or inflation or the cost of groceries. There's something wrong with Americans. But of course, when people listen to that speech, that's not what they heard. They heard and saw a man whom they thought was completely weak, who was ineffective. We had lost our standing on the global stage because of the Iran hostage crisis that was going on. And so if you see all the parallels, to the late 1970s with that of, currently, there's a lot going on there, right? It's almost eerily similar, to what is actually happening in terms of the mood, not necessarily, how we got into Iran or those issues that are currently causing our gas prices to spike and to inflation to continue to, increase, but to think about how a period of an unknown of where you're going. That sense of disillusionment really seems to be still very much a part in the 1980s, in the 1970s. But then you have Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan had previously run for office. He was actually the governor of California. And, so he has a political career. But interestingly enough, many people don't know this, but Ronald Reagan actually started out as somebody who was very much for unions and New Deal politics, right? Both of his parents were benefactors from the New Deal out of the Depression. He is an individual who went around, promoting, the work for General Electric as well as other, companies and the working man. But what we see in the late 1970s is a shift in that. As there becomes more deindustrialization and that shift to this idea from an us politics to a me politics, that cynicism is used by politicians to be able to focus not on what exactly are the real crises that are going on in America, such as the inequities in the economic system, or the problems in terms of political leadership, or the central dynamic of what is truly affecting people is poverty, right? It's not any of that. It is those culture issues. It is the fact that government is the problem, that government is and shouldn't be the ones that are coming in to decide where your taxes go and what should actually happen with them. And, you should be able to take care of yourself. You should be able to decide for yourself and figure it out on your own. And government is the problem. They're in the way, right? That attitude that really begins out of the 1970s, that cynicism that as a result of Watergate and ineffectual leaders like Ford and Carter is what Reagan capitalizes on. Because when Reagan comes onto the scene, when he is actually pushing these ideas, there's a famous quote that Reagan made when he was running for office, when he was actually running against Jimmy Carter in for the election in 1980, where he says he's actually in an area of New York, a very blue area, very democratic area of New York. And he's talking to these people and he says, well, a recession is when is when your neighbor loses their job. A depression is when you lose yours. And recovery is when Jimmy Carter loses his, right? People go ape wild for it. Now, what's fascinating about it is that while in the last 10 years or so, President Carter has gotten his accolades for all of the incredible work that he did in terms of trying to maintain peace, develop peace in the Middle East, improve issues in terms of health and education and the environment, right? Ronald Reagan comes on the scene and he really capitalizes on the cynicism of people and wants to put this whole idea of what Donald Trump eventually used, which was make America great again. And there was a huge ring to that because America seemed to have lost its standing in the world. People weren't doing well economically. There didn't seem to be, they weren't making things like they used to. They weren't that industrial powerhouse, right? Because things had shifted, right? From more of a industrializing nation to one that was actually into more of services and design. And that's only going to continue under Reagan. But when Reagan is inaugurated, on January 20th, which is actually quite fascinating. You can see this if you take a look at some of the video. The day of his inauguration on January 20th, there's actually a split screen, and they're showing half on one side is like the White House, and they're talking about how, Ronald Reagan will be the oldest man to ever take the office of the presidency, the only man to have been divorced, right? And to be married again and to take the oath of office, right? And on the other side of that split screen, they're literally showing the Iran hostages that were in the embassy and during the Iranian takeover in 1979 coming down an airplane after they had been released. And so what's so fascinating about it is that it looks as if Ronald Reagan is the person who's responsible for this. And he didn't do anything for this. This was all done under the Carter administration. But Carter doesn't get any of his, accolades for this. This looks like it's totally associated with Reagan. And that is a great way to actually start the presidency, is to actually see like how Ronald Reagan is able to encapsulate and capture and really being able to understand the people, right? Not necessarily that he cared, right? But that he understood what could get them motivated to do X, Y, and Z. How exactly could we change America in a way that would be able to improve it? Not for everybody. This is not going to be a period. The 1980s, ladies and gentlemen, is not a period of immense equality or expanding opportunity, right? There is growth, but it's for a certain segment of the population. So to let you know, so he gets inaugurated on January 20th. And there were many questions about what exactly Ronald Reagan's going to do. Remember, he was an actor prior to this. Prior to becoming governor, he was an actor. And so, for some people, we're just like, but of course, in California, that's not the first time that we've had an actor as a governor. Maybe some of you have heard. I was actually an undergrad student at UC Berkeley when Governor Schwarzenegger, Arnold Schwarzenegger, was the governor of California. His name is actually, his signature is on my diploma. Kind of a cool thing. But to be truth be told, was he a good governor? Absolutely. Probably one of the best that we ever had in the state. Surprisingly, right? If I could have voted for him again, I would have. Because he was really that good. Republican, certainly, but a Republican that put the values of republicanism beyond those of the culture wars, right? What you'll see is that the culture wars are really something that dominates here in the 1980s, especially under the Reagan presidency. As always, with these little yellow or gold links, go ahead and click on them. But one of the things that you can take a look is there's a documentary on Reagan's presidency. Pretty interesting. There's actually plenty on him. If you can actually find one of the best documentaries was actually one that was done by HBO maybe about 10 years ago. And it's probably one of the most intimate portraits of Ronald Reagan. Most of the documentaries really get at Reagan in his role as president. They don't really get at the intimate side of who this man was and what influenced him. But that one from HBO, unfortunately, I wasn't able to find it. And so I think you actually have to purchase it. But if you can, I would suggest that you take a look at it because it is quite good. But so we've got the Iran hostages being released. Ronald Reagan takes over. And immediately, literally 3 months later, there is an assassination attempt on his life. And here I'm actually going to show you the clip of it. Okay. So in this clip, you're going to see Ronald Reagan. He's coming out of one of the hotels after giving a speech. He's just, been a couple months into his inauguration. And let me show you what happened.
30th,
So I'm
1981,
gonna,
in a new blue suit, President
right.
Reagan appeared to tell to his side
Okay, so he comes out of the side entrance, and here we go.
entrance and passed a line of press photographers and TV cameras. He was almost at the car when he heard what sounded like two or three firecrackers over to his left.
Okay, so you see how close close that shooting was? Okay, that the shooter was a man by the name of John Hinckley. And he actually did he was able to hit President Reagan. Reagan was rushed to the hospital, immediately has surgery. And there's actually a very funny quote as Ronald Reagan is being wheeled into the hospital. um he's actually awake, for the surgery. And one of the things that we're going to talk about is how Reagan often used humor, and to basically you know get his opponents or get to people to be able to basically influence them. And so as he's being wheeled in, he says, are all of the surgeons Republican? And the surgeons sort of laugh, and they're just like, today, sir, we are all Republicans, right? What actually happened as a result of this assassination attempt was that Reagan actually comes out even stronger, right? He's got a Congress that is basically lockstep behind him. He comes out looking like, the man who survived, the worst assassination attempt, since Garfield or Lincoln, right? Or Kennedy. And, this is an individual who is now in charge, right? Comes back, is completely, people are just falling all over themselves to actually see the president back. And so then immediately what he starts to do in his first, 4 years is to institute his economic recovery plan. And that is essentially to bring down inflation. Now, y'all, you guys are already knowing what the inflation rate is like right now. You go to the grocery store, you see the price of gas, you see the price of groceries, you see your energy bills, right? Very similar to what was going on in 1980. Of course, put it into context. People were literally experiencing the same things. Interestingly enough, most of you probably, have, if you own a home or if you're interested in buying one, you see that the interest rate is at about 6.5%, right? Maybe you might be able to get it a little bit lower. But back in the 1980s, especially when President Reagan took office, interest rates were at 9% for a home. But remember, how much did a home cost in those days, right? We're talking about maybe 150,000, $200,000, right? The average home today is about $450,000, right? And that's average, right? That doesn't necessarily mean like, in major metropolitan areas, New York, Washington, D.C., Miami, Atlanta, San Francisco, right? So you want to think about all those aspects. But one of the things that really, is dominating, Reagan's period, and what is dominating this area as a whole, is the issue of inflation, is the issue of recession. How do we get this down? Now, there's several different theories on how to get this down, and you can clearly see what our country is trying to do at this moment. But the dominating idea from President Reagan was this idea that there's far too much spending in government. That needs to be cut. We also need to deregulate and be able to make more opportunities for businesses to be able to grow, flourish, so that they can hire people, pay people, and put more money back into the economy. And that we need to cut taxes, essentially. And so, like, the Economic Recovery Tax Act is one example. The problem with this is that most of the economic policies that were instituted by Reagan did two things. One was that they deregulated the system, meaning that the safety points that were put on to be able to make sure that businesses were on the up and up, that they weren't just making up, that they weren't taking, exorbitant risks, that they had enough money in the bank, right? That they weren't going to be doing undue harm or damage to the economy. These begin to be loosened in the 1980s, and it will increase in the 1990s, eventually leading to the financial and economic collapse that would happen in 2007. So that's where this really begins. The second thing is the tax policies. Yes, are there tax cuts, but very similar to the tax cuts that are being instituted by many Republican administrations, it often is very regressive, meaning that the benefits are often on the highest income earners and not on the lowest, right? It's that people usually at the bottom end up paying more or getting less back from their taxes as opposed to those people at the top. And so this is one of the first areas that Reagan's presidency really starts to, demonstrate is that we're not really interested in taking care of workers. We're not really interested in taking care of the little person or necessarily the middle class. We're really interested in big business because the idea is that one of the prime economic theories that that they have is this notion of excuse me, it's what is known as the Reagan is known as the Reagan the excuse me the Reagan tax plan, which essentially was like this. It's called the Laffer curve, okay, and it's what is known as top-down economics. This idea that if I had to give you an analogy, if you feed the horse enough oats, right, as a horse eats, right, a little bit of those oats go down to the ground and the sparrows can be able to feed themselves. That's essentially trickle down economics. Cut taxes at the very top so that they spend and buy, create new businesses, which then lead to more jobs. People open up more opportunities, businesses, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, the problem with that is that wealthy people don't necessarily just always spend their money on opening a business or aspects like that, right? What we see right now is that even with the tax cuts, we see companies across the United States cutting jobs. 7-Eleven is closing 600 stores within this year. We've already seen 30,000 layoffs with UPS, FedEx, Amazon, right? We're already seeing those types of cuts. And that was the same thing that was happening in the 1980s, is that as deregulation took place and as coming out of the deindustrialization of the 1970s, businesses, especially in manufacturing, cars in particular, began to leave the United States for other areas where they could do manufacturing cheaper to be able to earn more money and a greater profit, right? So this comes at the expense of the working class. But remember, one of the suggestions is that remember they're not just leaving overseas, but they're also going to the South, these businesses. So the idea is that maybe people should move, but people in Ohio, some people can't move. They can't leave Illinois. They can't leave, Indiana, right? And so this is really with that one half of the economic policy. The other aspect of Reagan's presidency is really spent on this idea of fighting the communism and keeping communists and communist agitators from the idea of expanding and encroaching upon American interests, right? The way that Reagan often frames this, and that many people who study Reagan, is that it's known as peace through strength. This idea that we create peace if we know that our enemy knows that we are serious in terms of being able to meet them with every sort of aspect in terms of their own policies. So this is one of the areas where we get the arms race, the increase in nuclear weapons, the idea that communism is the essentially the anti whatever to American capitalism, to American ideals. And these ideas are important. And I can tell you as a young kid growing up in the 1980s, you know we were often conditioned to see communism as an evil group, an evil empire. That was actually that term that Reagan comes up with in one of his speeches in 1983, the evil empire speech that you can actually watch. That is something that was a resounding, phrase that I often heard growing up. And it was associated with many things. It wasn't just the fact in terms of discussion. It was also seen in our television, right? If you look at the cartoons from the 1980s, they often posit this good versus evil aspect, right? Whether it's He-Man or G.I. Joe or any of the other numerous cartoons, right? They're always fighting some sort of bad, evil person, right? Could be Inspector Gadget, it could be the Smurfs, right? With Gargamel, it could be, it could be anything that was seen as the anti whatever the good was, right? And so as a kid growing up, that's how we were often, conditioned to see these things. And, it was in everything that we did. And so, these ideas of how the 1980s really come about, the goal for Reagan was really to be able to reduce the inflation, increase jobs, cut taxes, fight communism, and be able to give Americans a greater sense of self-respect. One of the best ways to see how Reagan saw this change in America can be seen in the re-election campaign of 1984. Let me play it for you. This is what is known as It's Morning Again in America. Now, I just want you to watch the video, okay? And just get a sense of of what you hear and see.
It's morning again. Today, more men and women will live than ever before in the country's history. With interest rates at about half the record highs of 1980, nearly 2,000 families today will buy new homes, more than at any time in the past 4 years. This afternoon, 6,500 young men and women will be married. And with inflation at less than half of what it was just 4 years ago, they can look forward with confidence to the future. It's morning again in America. And under the leadership of President Reagan, and stronger and better. Why would we ever want to return to where we were less than 4 short years ago?
I mean, all that, look at that, the rosiness, the lighting, right? All that very soft speaking. You hear that oboe in the background, right? But you also hear the numbers, right? But you don't hear anything like actual, concrete. It's just like, well, inflation's half of what it was. Americans are going to work. People are buying homes. They're getting married, right? All of that sort of aspect, right? And so this is what, honestly, in 1984, what ends up happening is that in that reelection campaign, there were many questions. They were like, Reagan is in his 80s, and he is, running for reelection. And, there is a question about his age. But I mentioned the issue of humor. Let me show you what happens in the reelection, the debate between President Reagan and Walter Mondale, who was running for president under the Democratic ticket. Okay, so you can watch the entire
That you would
thing
be
if you want, but this is probably where you want to just hear this. So this is Henry Twaywhift. He's a writer from the Baltimore Sun. So hey, go Baltimore, and just listen to the question that he asks.
who are responsible for the terrorist acts. And terrorist acts are such that our own United States Capitol in Washington has been bombed twice. Mr. Truitt, your question to President Reagan. Mr. President, I want to raise an issue that I think has been lurking out there for 2 or 3 weeks and cast it specifically in national security terms. You already are the oldest president in history, and some of your staff say you were tired after your most recent encounter with Mr. Mondale. I recall yet that President Kennedy had to go for days on end with very little sleep during the Cuba Missile Crisis. Is there any doubt in your mind that you would be able to function in such circumstances? Not at all, Mr. Truitt, and I want you to know that also I will not make age an issue of this campaign. I am not going to exploit for political purposes my opponent's youth and inexperience.
Okay, so you see how Reagan uses humor there, right? It's a very serious topic. We are in the middle of the Cold War. This is at the height of the Cold War. There are missiles, that are literally ready to be fired. It was not uncommon to see movies that discussed, what it would be like to survive a post-apocalyptic world. I mean, you can see some of these films from the 1980s, whether it's Red Dawn or The Day After, or what is the other one? Oh, Mad Max. Not the current ones, y'all. The ones from, the 80s, like Tina Turner with the earrings, right? And stuff like that, right? That post-apocalyptic world, because that was actually real. It wasn't uncommon, when I was a kid, for us to have, an air raid siren, right, as a way to just, know what would happen, should we, be attacked, right? These were things that were, at least acknowledged, a part of growing up. But what you see here with, with the question, a real true question, like, you're the oldest president, are you going to be able to make it through the day? Because people hear that you're tired. I mean, who isn't tired at, 80 years old, and having to make, decisions? But you see the way that Reagan used humor. And he uses that humor and he plays that. He's like, well, I'm not going to, exploit my opponents' youth and inexperience, right? And so, that gets a laugh out of people, and people find that to be funny. Here's the problem. And I think that many of you would probably see that, similarly with our current president or even with previous presidents, is that it's it's not that people don't, it's like sometimes people are like, well, Donald Trump is so funny, right? He's just a funny guy. And, what's interesting about that is that I think that most people would find what, Donald Trump would be funny if he wasn't president. Because, like the question posed to Reagan, is that his decision making, much like President Trump's, like all presidents, is that their decisions, their thoughts have consequences. That's the reason why it's not funny. And so, people might find humor and be like, oh, okay, but for real though, this old guy, is he about to fall asleep and, press the button that could, annihilate us all, right? But he uses that humor as a way to get at the issue in terms of working with the Soviets, working, creating an atmosphere for people where people could feel better about being an American. I mean, some of the best things, that President Reagan did is that he often would tell jokes, and jokes about the aspects of what it's like to live in the Soviet Union, jokes that he would collect often from people who were lived in the Soviet Union. And there's actually some very humorous ones there, but you should see that his work in terms of working against communism, containing it, trying to belittle it, making sure that, we try to do everything that's possible. But these efforts, in terms of whether it was, responding to, the attack in Beirut, or invading Grenada, or the Iran-Contra scandal, all of which demonstrate that in this period that Reagan was not without his faults, and certainly was not without his controversies, right? And so this is one of the things that really demonstrates the 1980s, is that the 1980s was really about a period where you had expanding ideas of an American sense of greatness, but you also had these points of extreme, mistrust and corruption on the part of the government. And so this is one of those aspects that, goes into thinking about it. When you look at Reagan and the Cold War, and let me just move my little screen there, that is Mikhail Gorbachev. He was the premier, the chairman of the Soviet Union. And, he and Reagan, became very close, during their time. Adversaries, certainly, but, people that, had to learn to work together, work together to, disarm nuclear weapons, work together, to be able to, move away from, total annihilation. But it's interesting, when you take a look at, when you take a look at the system of Reagan and the Cold War, there is a lot of critique that goes on there because many people ask themselves, was there really a strategy, on the part of Reagan and a part of his administration to be able to solve and address the Cold War? Did they want to contain Russia and the Soviet Union? Did they want to, be able to figure out, were they planning to try to win the Cold War? Like what exactly were the goals here? And that is one of the issues that still, historians discuss today is that, some would say that yes, there was an actual goal in terms of the administration, in terms of working against the Soviet interests and to be able to, basically cause this empire to eventually collapse. But then there was also people that would say that, well, his administration didn't seem singularly focused on that. It seemed to be, in a multitude of areas, and that there wasn't much of a plan that actually led to real changes. Now, of course, the Soviet Union does eventually collapse in 1991, and the system itself, is no longer. But the question is like, to what role did Reagan play? There certainly is, a role, that was played there. To what degree you may think that Reagan was, the hero, the person, the purveyor of, American ideals and eventually overcame communism, that just depends on where you stand with Reagan. But it is clear that Reagan's role as a president certainly gave Americans another sense of what was possible and what could be done, right? It was like evident, just from the historiography of this period that the by the 1980s, it was very much clear that the system of the Soviets wasn't going to be able to survive. Economically, it was under a collapse. It was not going to be able to take much longer. The question is how much did Reagan play into that? How much, was going to be done, right? All of those influences. But most importantly is just to be able to think about, the role that Reagan played. And that is one of, an individual who represented, the ideals of the American people, or at least what the ideals may have been, or that people thought that they were, and what exactly he did in terms of working with world leaders, telling Mr. Gorbachev to tear down this wall, being a diplomat, being an individual who was participatory in all these aspects, to actually see. But it's clear that at the time, the system of the Soviet Union was faltering. It was going to fall apart. Whether or not the Reagan administration actually had a plan in place as to what was going to happen as a result of that, it's unclear. There were plans, but we're not necessarily sure if that was the intention. So when I mentioned economics, one of the things that I really want to be able to talk about just to get that to you is that issue of Reaganomics, right? The key policies of that, right? Tax cuts, deregulation, cutting and spending, and of course, trying to combat inflation through, the Federal Reserve, right? The important things to understand about this is that, that there were some benefits to it, right? Inflation did come down, especially from the 1970s, right? There was, an unemployment drop, right? But there was also increased debt and spending, right? Tax cuts, which remember, when you are cutting taxes, you're really cutting into services for people, right? Whether that's Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, right? Benefits for the states, right? All of these aspects. And so what this does is this actually creates a greater bit of inequality in the system. And so, this is one of the reasons why it's like, think about, what exactly did Reagan do? Reagan really set up the United States for a deregulating country, one that is going to speed up, free trade, globalization, making America more of a less of an industrial powerhouse and more of a service industry. This is going to cause many people to lose their jobs. And so what you see is that you see that there are some aspects to this that, yes, many of the people who support Reagan and support, his ideology that many Republicans, did up until the time of Trump, you know, Reagan could have done no wrong. But were consequences to his economic system. And the greatest one was the series of inequality, right? That really, you have expanding forms of wealth, being concentrated on the top end of society at the expense of the middle and the lower classes. Of course, the 80s are not just about, Reagan, although he was the president during this decade, and it's not just about the Cold War, right? The 1980s is also about a period of culture, right? There's also huge changes in terms of like technology, our lifestyles, and the ways in which, we responded to the politics of the day. And one of the best ones is to actually, just think about all the different aspects of society, whether that's, MTV being launched in 1981, the amount of media, right? We have cable TV, right? CNN's 24-hour news service, right? The embracing of consumerism under yuppie culture, this idea that, what I wear, what I buy, tells who I am. So this is why people are interested in luxury goods, interested in certain types of lifestyle aspects, right? And this really comes out of the 1970s. Remember, in terms of that idea, that me generation, right? This center of me that I need to figure out who I am in order to understand the world, right? Well, who I am is somebody that can be embraced by stuff, right? Consumption. And so, really, like in the 1920s, the 1980s were a period of huge amounts of material consumption, right? That people were becoming more ambitious in what they did for work, what that was a status symbol, what position they have, what they, do they have the corner office? Do they have a window, right? Do they, what type of car do they drive, right? Brand of, sunglasses, right? All of those sort of things became big in the 1980s, right? I mean, if you think of like consumerism and culture, status was really determined by what you wore, what you ate, how you dressed, where you went to, where you were seen, right? And so, like one of the best examples is like in the 1980s at UNLV when they had that incredible basketball team under Tarkisian, Coach Sarkisian, they called where at the college basketball games, anybody who sat on the, on the court side, they called it Gucci Row because of what everybody was wearing, right? But that was the place where you wanted to see. That's that idea of that consumption culture, right? And so it was also, about fitness, right? Getting healthy. Jazzercise was a huge thing. Aerobics, getting in shape, right? And then also, of course, mall culture, right? This idea that, what you do on a Friday night, on a Saturday, as you go to the mall, consume, right? Buy, eat, engage, right? And of course, malls today are, empty shells of themselves, right? We buy all of our stuff online. We, maybe go to a boutique shop. But, the ideas of malls back in the day being the epicenter of where everybody would congregate, that's just no longer. Other things that, continued during the 1980s in terms of technology is the personal computer, right? You had the rise in terms of, Apple, IBM, the personal computer, the PC, right? You also had other home entertainment systems, the VCR, video consoles, right? Who didn't want a Nintendo or an Atari, right? You also had portable technology, the Walkman, right? And consumer grade camcorders. I remember my father having one, I mean, literally these things were the size of a suitcase, and they'd be on your shoulder, holding it. This is where documentation of everyday life comes into play, is in the 1980s. The ability in which to record it, to play it back, right? To be able to, save it, right? we take this for granted today, this idea that, on every single portable device, we are able to take pictures, record, send, write, post, right? Well, this is where it really begins in the 1980s, is this idea that you'd have these, huge, camcorders and, recording devices, right? Your own personal Walkman of listening to music, right? On your own. But there were also, events that went on in society, globally, whether it's, communism, the fall of the Berlin Wall, this idea that, first of all, like, especially with Nancy Reagan, the just say no, right? Drug culture, right, is very big. Um, we have, the ability of when you have that consumerism culture growing in, you also had opportunities in which to access some drugs, which such as cocaine, right? The 1980s were huge for cocaine, right? You'd have these cocaine parties, going on, where, people would really just, come and, do a little cocaine and be high and enjoy themselves, right? Because it's all recreational. It's not that big of a deal. Of course, this all changes, with when there was the death of Len Bias in the 1980s, which basically caused, an entire 180 with drugs and culture, because this was a very famous basketball player, dies from an overdose of cocaine, and then suddenly the drug war, which had started in the 1970s as one of being able to give treatment and help, now goes into a full onslaught of criminalization in the 1980s. And especially as a young kid, the just say no or the Dog McGruff, take a bite out of crime, these were things that were constantly reinforced to us, right? You see somebody that offers you drugs, you just say no, right? A drug dealer, according to, Ronald Reagan and Nancy Reagan, is a criminal. And these are people who need to be punished, right? And anybody who uses, and this would go into the 90s under, the first George Bush, that, well, if you are an individual who is, you know, selling drugs, the person who is buying it is just as much of a criminal, right? The criminalization of usage. Not that that person is an addict, not that that person needs help. They just need to be thrown in prison. And that's really where this begins, especially in the 1980s, this fear culture that really begins. One of the things to really understand about, this period of society is that the fear that was perpetrated in the 1980s was the reason why, like, horror movies or disaster movies really were successful, is because they were actually happening, right? The movie that takes place in the 1980s, not the new one, the old one from the original Stephen King, right? Children were being kidnapped. They were on the back of milk cartons, right? The idea of not getting into a stranger's car or being kidnapped off the street, that was real for me when I was a little kid. There was always that fear of missing children, of people going missing, and of being kidnapped left and right. That, the fear of nuclear holocaust. These things are real. That's the reason why these horror movies, these films did very well, is because the reason why people were entertained by them is because it was actually happening. It wasn't a fantasy. It's not like, some of these other like horror films that talk about like this gruesome, this gore, right? A true horror film is something that actually can happen or is happening. And that's what makes it so scary, because it actually is true, okay? Or possible. Now, other aspects in terms of social issues, and I won't get into all these, but you can certainly click on the links here. One of the things that I would like to highlight in terms of the global aspect of what was going on, not just in the United States, but across the world, was the AIDS crisis. The 1980s were dominated by a new disease that was taking place in the early 1980s. It was first discovered amongst gay men, and it eventually got this name called GRID. It was associated as the gay plague, but eventually it has changed, because what the scientists didn't know at the time is that how exactly people caught it. It seemed to be isolated around one group of individuals, gay men, but eventually it was starting to show up in hemophiliacs. It started to show up in newborn babies. It started to show up in people who needed blood transfusions, right? All of these sort of aspects. And so what eventually was discovered is that it was a blood disease, right? It could be transferred through blood, transfusions, through blood fluids. And so this sort of aspect in terms of the AIDS crisis really dominated the 1980s in terms of like stigma, homophobia. There was massive activism because there was a huge amount of government indifference. President Reagan didn't even say the word AIDS until the end of his second term, right? And even then, some of his policies were seen as extremely insensitive, right? His idea that, where he used to be a champion of people, immigrating into the United States, he put in a new policy, I believe it was in 1986 or 1987, where he said that it would be possible for us to limit people to come into this country if they could have been possibly exposed to the AIDS virus or if they had the AIDS virus. Not very compassionate. This period, in terms of, trying to understand the disease because the scientists didn't have the answer at the time. The goal was only to do, basically social policy. Well, what do we do? Do we close the bathhouses? Do we get people to, protect themselves in sex, more condoms, more knowledge, right? All these aspects. And it really was this confluence of factors between the AIDS crisis, drug culture, right? All of these aspects in terms of these tensions and inequalities. Very, but take a look at the documentary here. It's on Frontline. It's called The Age of AIDS. And it talks about that global aspect of AIDS and the HIV crisis, throughout the world. The 1980s also saw a shift in terms of, poverty and homelessness, namely as a result of the deregulation and the loss of jobs that had happened basically starting in the late 1970s. But it also saw a difference. It's also saw an extreme opportunities for women. More and more women were finding themselves in positions of power and influence, whether that's in corporate America, whether that's in, government. You saw the first Supreme Court woman justice, to be elected by Ronald Reagan, Sandra Day O'Connor, who sat, on the court for decades. We also saw, reform and issues in terms of like education, like a nation at risk, which really outlined this idea that America was falling behind, academically, in terms of its ability to be able to create a society that would be able to keep up with the rest of the world, because we saw the incredible, economic successes of other countries, namely Europe and Asia, especially Japan, right? So these were those issues that were going on at the time. And of course, the United States and Reagan's position in terms of, labor and aspects like that can really be summed up like in the 1981 air traffic controller strike, where he literally gave them several days to get back to work, and if he didn't take it, he fired them, essentially using his ability to be able to put national security over that of labor relations. This basically set a precedent for, the demise of labor unions in the United States that basically would go on a decline throughout the 1980s, because essentially what happened is that, you know, private businesses won and labor got their ass kicked. And that's really how you can sum up that period in terms of labor. So that expanding inequality, a sense of, purpose and direction that you could get under Reagan, trying to contain and fight the Soviets, right? But also that period of unease, but also a period of, self-expression and advancement, whether that's in fashion or in technology or in personal, computing, right? The 80s are filled with all of those things. So if you have any questions or any comments, please feel free to reach out to me anytime.